You're wrong. You're wrong. You can't even argue with me right with that. What is going on, YouTube and Spotify? Welcome back to a brand new episode of For the Love of Humankind. I'm your host, Jeff, and let me tell you, I am excited and I have been looking forward to this episode for quite some time. And I know I feel like I say that quite a bit, but this episode is going to get people heated, and I cannot wait for the comment section, so bring it on. Originally, my plan was to have a guest with me on this week's episode, but schedules conflicted, things fell through, and so here I am. I've done my research and I'm ready. So what are we talking about today, Jeff? Like, why do you think that there's going to be some backlash and there's going to be a lot of comments? One, because I know the people who listen to my podcast. And I'm hoping that because of this episode, more people will listen. Because I think that this is a topic that we have skated around in society for a little bit, and people just don't want to talk about it. Or people are talking about it and people just don't want to listen. Because they think it's not their problem. And so let's talk about the housing crisis. Some of you are probably like, the housing crisis? Jeff, What housing crisis? So let's take a step back, right? Let's do some history lessons here. Let's talk about the evolution of the housing crisis, right? Because housing crisis looks very different towards a lot of different individuals. We have had different definitions throughout history and examples of what a housing crisis is. So let's get the context, and then we'll bring it back. We'll bring it back to the atrocity that is our country at the moment, and it's not even just our country, and we'll talk about that too. So let's go back to the early 1900s. We'll talk about the 1920, where this is kind of one of the first. I'm going to say first. It's not the first. But it's one of the first recorded in U.S. history. Obviously, there's like more prevalent of like sanitation, all of that stuff before that even existed, that caused a lot of housing issues and crises. But in the 20s, right? So thinking back to the 1920s, Prohibition era, this is when we initially started to see an overcrowding and sordid living. You had a ton of people living in one space. There weren't a lot of places to reside. And then you just start to see this lack of ability to live healthily. Healthily, one of those words, right? So that's one of that's where we're going to start, right? Then we're going to jump ahead 20 years. And right around that time, I think there was like some sort of like war or something happening. There absolutely was a war happening. And because of all the focus on the war effort, there was a lack of housing production, right? Because most of the individuals that would have worked on the housing production, or would have been in that field of that role, were drafted to the army, therefore fighting in the war. So already you see that we have two very different housing crises within 20 years, right? And now let's jump ahead to 2008, right? So we're going to jump ahead 68 years. Obviously, if we're assuming that it was just 1940, obviously it took place throughout the 40s, wasn't just 1940. So we're looking at 60 plus years in between notable housing crises, right? So 2008 we saw the housing bubble crash, right? And I remember being in high school when that happened. My family was actually in the process of considering moving from Michigan to Illinois because my dad had been working in the Naperville, Chicago area of Illinois. And he was really there. He was there for like 5 years. And so he was coming back like, once or twice a month. Then it became like once every 3 months, and then it just fizzled out, right? But trying to find a house during that time was super, super difficult. And because one, people were trying to, get rid of their house because everything crashed, right? Right. And so we're seeing individuals out here who put a lot of money into their houses and now are not getting that return back in 2008, right? And so now here we are 14 years later in another housing crisis, which really just did not start. This has been an ongoing thing, and it's not so much a housing crisis. And for those of you who think because Trump wasn't in office, because Biden's in office, because the government, wasn't protecting homeowners, you're wrong. You're wrong. You can't even argue with me right with that. We were in a housing crisis way before either of those two were in office. And I will tell you why. So it's not so much a housing crisis as it is a living wage crisis, an affordable living crisis. For those of you that were against raising minimum wage, you are the problem. That's it. You are the issue. Because minimum wage was established so people could make a living, just a living, without any extravagance in their life, but just to make a living. And in 50 states, minimum wage, working full time, you cannot afford rent. You can't afford to live in any state, anywhere. And so that's where our conversation begins, because that's atrocious. Not to mention the plethora of different identity groups that are suffering even further from this crisis. And we'll hop into that here in a little bit. But what we're seeing, right, is an increase in high cost rent, high cost homes, high cost living of everything. Yet the minimum wage has stayed the same. Like, I'm pretty sure Michigan's minimum wage literally just got raised 22 cents. Is this thing on? 22 cents to $9.65 is your minimum wage. Yet the price of rent continues to go up. The price of food and healthcare and everything else goes up except wages. Like, please make it make sense. Make it make sense. That's all I have to say with that. But we're seeing this lack of affordable living options for individuals, right? Like, there are individuals out there that are working 40 hours, and a minimum wage job isn't enough to cover housing anywhere, as I've stated in the US. Yet we're blaming them for not putting in enough work to afford housing. Like, we tell them, you should do better. You should do better with your money. Okay, like, I am not one to talk about saving money because I'm shit at saving money. But I at least know it's not their fault for not being able to afford to live. Obviously, the US is one of the highest countries when it comes to homelessness, and there is a reason why that is a thing. There is a reason why the US is so high in homelessness. So I already talked about the minimum wage, but we have also seen a huge reduction and lack of any sort of funding going towards Section 8 housing. During the Trump campaign and 4 years in office, we saw a huge reduction in Section 8 housing, which, if you are unfamiliar with Section 8 housing, is housing for individuals and families who are unable to cover the cost of regular housing. So this is government-sponsored housing, or supposed to be, that no longer is getting funded, seeing a lack of it in any major city. And that's the government's decision. This was something that was put forth by the government. Well, maybe not necessarily by the government, but was funded. And here we are, reducing funding of its own people. We love that. We love that. Not only that, right? We've been in this pandemic. I don't know if you've heard of it, for the last 2.5 years, where people still think that it was fake. We saw the eviction moratorium, right? Which allowed individuals who may have lost their job, who may have had COVID, push back payments for their rent, and then they were able to pay it once they either received unemployment or were able to catch up on their payments later on, right? And now we are seeing this moratorium end at the end of this month, which not only is going to evict a ton of individuals from their current housing, so we'll see an increase in that homelessness number, but we're also now going to see an increase in availability of housing that's still going to be more expensive than somebody can afford. And so I want you to think about why that makes no sense at all. I want you to think about, like, why are we doing that? Well, landlords are scum. That's one. And we're going to talk more about landlords here very, very shortly. But we're also seeing a lot of these residential properties, whether it's apartment complexes, whether it's actual housing units, being purchased by corporations or businesses. And they're doing this because they themselves are now trying to get more money. And so there was an article that was released within the last couple of months that was talking about corporate landlords. And so those corporations that have now purchased housing units that are trying to make money for their corporation, right? and they are considering themselves landlords. And so if you have ever lived in an apartment complex or condo or whatever housing unit you want to use in that sentence that has a landlord, your landlords are the individuals that are supposed to help take care of any issues that arise in that space. And so what we are seeing is these corporations or just regular landlords overseeing these complexes. People are reporting these issues that should be fixed by a landlord. They aren't being fixed, so they're moving out. The landlord is now increasing the rent prices without still fixing the issues that were there before. So people are paying a high cost of living for having a shitty quality living experience. And that makes zero sense. No matter how you see politics, you have to understand that this is a political issue. You have to understand that this is not an issue that is on individuals trying to afford housing. This is an issue on those that are paying these individuals, as well as the elected officials that are in office. Okay, Jeff, so you're saying that it's not on those individuals. You're just putting the blame on other people. So like, what can we do? That is a great question, right? And as any major political issue, a big part of making a difference, speaking to city council, speaking to senators, governors, voting for things that are focused on housing, and especially Section 8 housing when it comes up in elections. But when and I will say that I fall victim. Shouldn't say fall victim. I am often have been terrible about this in the past before I legitimately started doing my research, is seeing somebody on the streets who's asking for money or who is asking for food and ignoring them and walking away, assuming that that this is their fault. And oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it is not their fault at all that they cannot afford someplace to live or to stay. And part of that becomes, again, that greater issue. And there's actually a statistic that talks about the amount of affordable listings that are out there for people to live in compared to households in general. And so there is one affordable listing for every 65 households that are published as being up for rent or sold. 1 in 65. So you take that, you divide that however you want amongst websites like apartments.com, Zillow, whatever. 1 in 65 is an affordable listing for your average individual. If that doesn't make you mad, if that does not make you mad, I don't know what will, right? Because we have not only seen a decline in the U.S. population growth. U.S. population growth used to be pretty high amongst the world. That and China have been among the top. But we've seen falling birth rates, and decline in immigration. For obvious reasons, I'll let you all connect the dots with that one. And so we are seeing all of these houses that are empty. We are seeing apartments that are empty, houses that are empty, condos that are empty, that could easily house all of these individuals that are homeless. But we're choosing not to because they can't afford to live there for a variety of reasons, because minimum wage doesn't pay for it. Again, please make it make sense. I don't know what to tell you. But what I will say is, when you think about how important it is to have some sort of shelter over your head, right? A birthright, if you will, to have shelter. God forbid you're not provided shelter throughout your life. God forbid. Right? Those individuals that are not provided with shelter, or their family can't afford housing, or there's not Section 8 housing, they're forced to live X, Y, and Z, right? This not only impacts their schooling, which then impacts their ability to get a job, which then impacts the economy, which then impacts everybody that probably listens to this that is living in an apartment or a house. And so I want you to think about where you fall in that line, because if you are supporting a government that does not want to increase minimum wage because you think that your prices are going to go up, that is a type of privilege that should not exist. And I'm going to say that. I'm going to say that right here. Because as a birthright, you deserve to have shelter. You deserve to have a place to live. And so one of the things that I've been doing recently, and I've been reading this book called Hood Feminism, which is a phenomenal book, which talks about a myriad of feminist issues, and often how Latinx or Black women, or women of underrepresented identities are often left out of the mainstream white feminist movements. And one of the things that I talk about in this book is housing, and how it is, not only a racism issue, a classism issue, and a feminist issue, but white feminism doesn't even fight for the correct housing. And the author goes on to talk about how, in the workforce, we already know that women tend to make less than men do in the workforce, which is a whole nother issue upon itself. But women of color tend to make even less. Not to mention, when cities start to gentrify and build all of these housing units because they think that they're doing something good, they're over-policing these areas, and yet it is still unaffordable to be in areas like this. And so a majority of the time, we start to see single Black or single women of color being single moms. And I don't know why I said single so many times, but being single moms for a myriad of reasons. And I will let you connect the dots on that statement. And so now we're looking at an affordability issue. We're looking at a system that are consistently putting underrepresented individuals behind, as we always have, we're not providing them options. Like, we're putting them literally, like, we're at a baseball game, we're putting them in the parking lot. Like, they don't even get a chance to swing. Because we're putting them so far behind. And it's not their fault. It legitimately is not their fault. And so here's my issue with this affordability crisis, this housing crisis, whatever you want to label it as to help yourself sleep at night. This isn't just their issue. This is every single one of our issues. If you live in a lavish home, good for you. You probably overpaid for that house. And that's one less home that is empty, right? But at the end of the day, that doesn't negate that people are struggling to find housing, struggling to afford housing, struggling to live. And so I ask you, what are you going to do? How are you going to help a systematic issue that has been in place for so long? We just like to call it different things. I'm going to let you think on that. I'm going to let you think on it. Because I'm going to continue to think on it. Because even though I've done my research, I got to figure out ways that I can help with that. And so I leave you with this question. If you had family, friends, kids, whatever, who couldn't afford housing or find affordable housing, are you still going to blame them? Is it still their problem, or is there something bigger at play? I don't know. I'll let you figure that out. But thank you for joining me for this rant-filled episode for the love of humankind. We'll be back in another 2 weeks. Be you, stay safe, and treat others better than you treat yourself.